Blog Talk Radio.
Bichamo Afurakani Afuraitkaitnit EGUA Medinde Ojirapo Kwesi Rada Hambata Akan AKONGUASUA ATMU Ojirapo. That means greetings to all Afurakani Afuraitkaitnit people, meaning Africans, black people. Today is EGUA Day, Marketplace Day. My name is Ojirapo Kwesi Rada Hambata Akan, Ojirapo of the Akwamu Nation in North America. Irase, we thank you for tuning in to this special edition of EGUA Marketplace Day. We're going to focus on some different information for this particular day, simply because, well, two reasons. One, because today is Abukuadai, which is an Akan ancestral observance, which occurs every sixth Awukuda, or every sixth Wednesday. It also happens to be the fake New Year's Eve observance. So we want to get into some information dealing with that. So we're going to put a couple of links in the chat room based on the information we're going to deal with. So one of them is our poll page, which you'll find the information regarding the Akan New Year, traditional New Year. We're also going to give you one of the links to the dates dealing with the astronomical zodiac, just so you can see that. And we also want to make sure that individuals know that we are actually on. If you have any questions or comments, if you're on the phone line, you can hit the number 1 so that we can see your hand is raised. If you are in the chat room, in order to interact in the chat room, you must log in with a username. If you don't have a username, you can create one in Blog Talk quickly, and you'll be able to log in using that username and then interact, ask questions, post in the chat room as well. All right. So we just want to make sure that everybody's in right now. I'm going to send out one of these messages right quick, and then we'll get started. And we wanted to cover this information because, as usual, when we're dealing with certain aspects of, or most aspects of our culture, there's a great deal of misinformation propagated by, of course, the whites and their offspring. That is their nature. They're always going to propagate false information. They're never going to propagate accurate information. Anytime they put something out that's accurate, it's always going to be followed up by misinformation. That's the way they operate. So, but then we have misinformation propagated by black people who either simply are followers of the whites and their offspring because of misinformation or because they work on behalf of the whites and their offspring. So we want to get into this information in detail. So when you look at, first of all, when you're looking at the what we talked about for the episode, the info on the episode, I want to also put this link on the NHOMA page on the website. This is the page with our publications, but a couple of them we'll deal with. One of them is the ODOMANKOMA publication. We're going to check that out. So when you see when we mentioned on the event notification for ODOMANKOMA and ATMU Khepra, ATMU KHOPA, as well as NYANKOPON-NYANKONTON, those two books you can find on the NHOMA page. And, of course, the PDF versions are free download. So we can pull those up real quick. All right. So getting into the information. So what we have is, of course, people are talking about New Year's Day tomorrow. Of course, that is not our traditional New Year's Day. And the dates have fluctuated with regard to the whites and their offspring as well. But when you look at what a real traditional New Year's Day is, there are reasons why we have observances. They're based on reality. They're based on the position of the sun, its effect upon Earth, the position of certain stars, Soroma, their effect upon the Earth Mother, and their effect upon us physically, and the energy coming from these celestial bodies affecting us spiritually as well, because the abosom, the spirits that animate creation, including the stars, including our sun, their spirits empower our spirits just like the physical body of the sun, and its radiance keeps up our physical body and strengthens our physical body. The spiritual energy that animates the aurea of the sun stimulates our spiritual energy as well. So when we have any kind of observance, it's based on a direct connection to the abosom in creation, something that's measurable, something that's quantifiable, something that's real, not something that's just made up. So, of course, when you're dealing with a New Year celebration, why would the White Star Spring have the New Year in the dead of winter, the darkest time of the 24-hour cycle, midnight, the coldest time of the year? Then the White Star Spring come out and yell Happy New Year. Where would they get that from? What does that have to do with anything? So, first, if you're looking at our New Year, for example, in the Akan tradition, and different Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit groups have different times of the year that they observe the cycle. Beginning of the cycle or the halfway point, it varies with groups. In the Akan tradition, for most Akamfo, for those who have not been brainwashed and embraced January 1st as the New Year, which is foolish, then typically the New Year is around the period around August, September, or October, around the equinox, but it's the time of the harvest. So it's a yam festival. It's the time of the second harvest. It's called Paul Bede, and when you look at, you go to our Apo page, Apo and OBRADWIRA. So we have two different observances that we briefly describe on this page. The first one is Apo Afashe, which is the Apo festival that happens around, for us, in March, around April, in the Wenchi region of Ghana, amongst the Akan, the Bono in that region. The Sefwi people who are also Akan also celebrate that festival as well. And they call it Aliye, but it's still the same festival that they carried with them when they migrated away from the Bono region to the Sefwi region. The Asona Abusia, the Asona clan amongst the Sefwi people, they still observe the Apo festival. They call it Aliye. So we go into detail about that. You scroll down and you'll see OBRADWIRA, NANANOMSOM. Now, that is the terminology that we use in Akwamu Mine, Amaruka, Atefimu, in the Akwamu Nation in North America. The general term is Ojira. We just have a more descriptive term, OBRADWIRA, life. Obra means life or existence. So OBRADWIRA is a life Ojira. Ojira means purification. It also means a celebration of purification. NANANOMSOM is just a further definition of the title. Som means to serve. NANANOMSOM means an ancestral service or ancestral observance, ancestral ritual practice. So it's just a further definition of Ojira. We just call it OBRADWIRA, life purification. NANANOMSOM, ancestral ritual practice. Our 7-day New Year celebration begins on either September 16th or September 17th, depending on the year, and the last day is September 22nd or September 23rd, depending on the year, and that September 22nd or September 23rd date is the first day of our New Year. This year, September 22nd was the first day of the autumn or Atem and Atemet equinox, and therefore that was the first day of our New Year. Our New Year is 13,015. Of course, not 2015. So first of all, we're, over 90 days ahead of, the whites and their offspring New Year, of course. Secondly, 2015 has no relevance because there was no Jesus, Yeshua ben Pandera, none of that. Never existed, black, white, or otherwise. So, of course, we will not utilize a date based on a fictional cartoon character who never existed in any form whatsoever. We are in the midst of a 26,000-year cycle. The Earth spins on its axis, of course, but then it's also in a wobbling motion as well. It gyrates in a wobbling motion just like a top. So the axis, as it's spinning around on its axis, the axis also spins around in a wobbling fashion and describes a circle within the quote-unquote heavens of the black substance of space. That wobbling motion of the Earth, and it's wobbling back and forth, of course, the Earth spins around in 24 hours. It only takes 24 hours for the Earth to just spin on its axis. But that wobbling motion of the Earth, that one entire wobble or circle takes 26,000 years on average. So that's considered, that's what they call, that plays directly into the precession or the movement of the equinoxes. And we're going to get into that. But we're in the midst of a 26,000-year cycle. When they talk about the Septepi, or the first time, the time of the creation, and time of Al-Sar and so forth, the beginning of a new cycle, that Septepi, when they're talking about the time of Al-Sar in ancient Kemet, 13,000 years ago, that was the beginning of a new cycle. Hence the years beginning with 13,000. So we're in 13,015 based on that cycle. And this is the year that we use, of course. So, and September 22nd was our first day of that new year. As you see on the page, we say Ojita is celebrated for 7 days in some areas and 40 days in other areas, but typically it's 7 days. Ojita is a term meaning purification. At the end of one cycle, year, and the beginning of a new cycle, year, it behooves us to purify ourselves physically and spiritually. It is a time to reestablish the values of our ancestral culture and rededicate ourselves individually and as an Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, African community to our individual and collective Nkrabia, or our divine function. So that's what we're rededicating ourselves to and purifying our focus. Through Ojita, we enter the new year cycle with a renewed spirit, a renewed drive to accomplish, and a renewed focus to eliminate all obstacles to our success, whether they be physical, including human, and or non-physical. So we showed the Medutu, the hieroglyphs for the term Jita, TWRA or DWRA, DWR. Sometimes they don't have the vowels in certain words spelled out, but the key is, in the Akan tradition, we can put forward a proper vocalization for this term. So it's not just TWR like Tur or Tura or Dura. We vocalize that term in the Akan tradition as Jita and spell it DWIRA. In ancient Kemet, it means, again, to clean, to cleanse, to purify, also to celebrate a ceremony of purification. So in the Akan language, Jita means to purify, Jita means to cleanse, or Jita also means a celebration of purification. And then in the Medutu, Jita means to cleanse, to purify, also to celebrate a ceremony of purification. The key is not only that simple definition there, when you go into the ritual practices of the people who still speak the language and practice the culture, it's not just a ceremony of purification. We have that ceremony. It's 7 days, and there are things that are done on those 7 days, so we still practice the culture. So some people who are disconnected from a culture, or especially like whites and offspring, pretending to know something about ancient Kemet, all they can do is read, this means purification, it means a celebration of purification. That's all they can say. we can say the same thing because the word still exists in our language, but also the ceremony still exists in our language and revolves around the harvest time, the new year, and there are ritual practices associated with this 7-day celebration. So we have the details in the culture because it's a lived culture. It's not a dead culture. So we get into some more detail up under that image, talking about Jita and so forth, and then we talk about our celebration for 7 days. When you look at the sunrise at on the eastern horizon, peaking at noon directly above your head, and then setting in the west at the western horizon at the evening period, and then going into the quote-unquote underworld and going all the way to the bottom, which is midnight, and then coming back up around, say 6 o'clock in the morning, around the equinox at sunrise. When you look at that cycle, and if you look at a clock, the face of a clock with the 4 points, and you have, say, 3 o'clock is like the east, 12 o'clock is like the north, 9 o'clock is like the west, and 6 o'clock, the number 6 is like, like the south, basically. If you look at that cycle and then you equate it to the year, the sun rising in the east is akin to the spring, March 20th, 21st, March 19th, and so forth. The sun reaching its highest point in the sky at noon and the hottest time of the day, that is akin to, the summer solstice, when the sun rises at its highest arc in the sky around June 21st, on average. When the sun sets in the evening period, and there's, evening of the day, that is akin to the autumn equinox. And then when the sun goes, hits midnight, the darkest time of the day of the 24-hour cycle, that is akin to the winter solstice, the darkest time of the year, the shortest day of the year, 9 hours of sunlight, about 15 hours of darkness. That's the winter solstice around December 20th, 21st, and so forth. So when you look at that cycle, you're looking at the same solar cycle, and of course we rise and set with the sun generally as well. Our new year is associated with that cycle. So for example, when you see the sun setting, it's the end of the hot half of the day, or the upper half of the circle of the clock, the upper half of the earth, and so forth. It's the end of that cycle, and then the sun goes and sets in the west, and it penetrates and goes underground, and that is akin to a seed being planted in the ground. So that's around September 23rd, September 22nd, the equinox. Equinox means equal nights, 12 hours of sunlight, 12 hours of darkness. So that's akin to the sun going into the ground, seed being planted in the ground. What happens when the seed is planted in the ground? First, there's germination, and then the roots go down deep into the soil. So then the sun goes down deep into the quote-unquote underworld, gets rock bottom, which is December 21st, the darkest time of the year, the darkest day, shortest hours of sunlight, and so forth. Roots going down deep in the blackness, just like the seed. But then, eventually, the sun rises at the spring equinox. Now, the sprouts began to shoot upwards, and then they break through the surface of the earth, just like the sun rising from the horizon on the east and breaking through the quote-unquote underworld. And then the sun reaching the highest point in the sky, that's June 21st, and also like noon, that's also like the full flowering of the plant. After it's sprouted, it's still new sprouts, but then once it reaches that highest point, it's the full flowering, the full development of the plant. And then when the sun starts going down towards the evening, and hitting the evening and about to set, the sun's about to set, as well as going down towards the autumn equinox once again. It's falling towards the autumn equinox. It was at 15 hours of sunlight, 9 hours of darkness at its highest point, the longest day of the year, and then the days start to shorten and shorten and shorten. Longer periods of darkness, the sun is falling down towards sunset on a daily basis, and the equinox, and it's about to penetrate and go into the ground. So that's the fall period. That means the fruits are falling off of the fully flowered plant. And once you hit September 22nd, September 23rd, then that is time to harvest what you have grown. To take everything that is developed, fully flowered, became fully grown and so forth, then they fall. It's fall time. You capture those fruits and vegetables and produce and so forth. You harvest them, and then you utilize them for your benefit. Not only do you harvest them, but then it's also time for the seed to be planted in the ground. So it's the end of one cycle, the fall, the full flowering and the harvest, but it's also the beginning of a new cycle, the seeding period, so the cycle can continue. So this is why Akanfo say the ends of the year have met at our 7-day New Year celebration at Ojeda. So this is a cycle we deal with, and we base it on the movements of the Oriya, the movements of the sun. That's a real cycle. That's a legitimate cycle. It affects us on a daily basis. Our rising and setting should be in accordance with the sun and the energetic output of the sun and so forth. Same thing during the course of the year. And we engage in those similar activities throughout the course of the year, whether it's planting, seeding, germinating, sprouting, and fully flowering, whether it's business, whether it's education, whatever we're doing, we're moving through these cycles and taking advantage of the energy of these various aspects of the year so we can utilize that energy for our best benefit. No different than somebody going out when it's warm outside to get some sun, get some energy, stimulate themselves, charge their abatum, charge their melanin for their greatest benefit. We do the same thing, not just during the day or during the summer, but all throughout the year. We take advantage of the shift in energy. So that's the basis of a real year. Now, the whites and their offspring, why would they have a year based on darkest time of the year, the coldest time of the year, the least amount of sunlight during the year, and that's when they come out and scream, Happy New Year, in the middle of the night, in the cold, in the dark, and the period of the year where nothing is developing, nothing is growing, and so forth. Then they scream Happy New Year. A cave dweller in a glacial environment, living in the darkest, coldest regions, that would make sense for a cave dweller to be excited about darkness, coldness, shortness of daylight, and so forth, and they would come out and scream Happy New Year when it's dark and dead. But that doesn't make sense for an Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit person, an African person. That's insane. So when people say, well, I'm not really celebrating the New Year, I'm just, that's all semantics, I'm just getting together with family and so forth, the reality is, if somebody put a video camera on you and a video camera on the white family and turn the sound off, you're in lockstep with the whites and their offspring. You are participating in their cultural practices which have no relevance for you at all. The only thing they do is reinforce the idiocy of white culture and force our people to continue to accept it. Because if you continue to engage, then what you're really doing is accepting it. It doesn't matter what you say about it, you're still engaged in the process. Somebody can say, well, I'm not doing crack anymore. I don't believe in crack cocaine anymore. I don't have anything to do with that anymore. I know it's wrong. I know it's foolish. So I'm done with it. But since my family is still on crack, I'll smoke crack with them. But I'm really not a crackhead, and I'm not really involved in that culture. The reality is you're still a crackhead, and you're still putting that poison in your system. So nobody's listening to you when you make these excuses. The whites and their offspring know the nigga's still doing what we told them to do. So they, of course, will dismiss you, not that you're trying to impress them anyway, but then our own people will dismiss anything you have to say as well because they see that you're still participating. You're still engaged in incorporating and showing respect for disordered culture, and you're also continuing to place value on that disordered culture. If you didn't place any value in it, you would just stop. Many people, once they embrace reality, they stop. It doesn't matter what anybody else in the family is doing. They know what's true. What's true is most important. That's what we place value on, and we don't engage in that nonsense anymore, and that's just the bottom line. It's over. And we have no desire to do so whatsoever, and it's over. And people will do that for 10, 15, 20 years ongoing and don't even consider entertaining that nonsense anymore. Then other people have excuses. So, but when we deal with this, them coming into this false New Year, first of all, it deals with, like we said, cave dwellers and glacial periods. That makes sense for them to be excited about that kind of thing. Then when you look at their explanations about why they changed the quote-unquote New Year to January 1st, of course, you look in the fake religious tradition, Christianity, you have the fictional character Jesus. They placed that birth on December 25th in mimicry of Heru. And we talked about Asar, Aset, and Heru and broke down the entire story based on our book, The Kukutuntum, proving that Jesus never existed. Yeshua ben Pandera never existed. There was no historical Jesus or, mythological Jesus at all. There was no Gnostic Jesus walking around healing people. Never happened, including the fictional character in the Talmud. No Isa, none of that. But they'll place the fictional character's birth on December 25th, dealing with the cycles of the sun and the beginning of the increase in light around December 25th. And then 8 days after December 25th, according to their calendar, will be January 1st. And because of their, fake scriptures and Luke, when they talk about on the 8th day, the fictional character Jesus, the baby, was circumcised. Then the Eastern churches have the, festival of the circumcision, and that's on the 8th day, and that's January 1st, and they consider that the New Year, and they honor that as the New Year. So this is where they will talk about people getting that from, and this is why they shifted over to. And sometimes they were celebrating the New Year at different times. They were imitating other Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit groups. Sometimes they were having the New Year celebration in March, around March 25th, talking about that would have been the pregnancy or the conception of the fictional character Mary, because they had to count back 9 months from December 25th. So they started having that at March 25th, imitating what our people were doing, lying about the culture and so forth. So they used to have it there, but then they shifted it over to December 25th, dealing with the circumcision of the fictional character Jesus. So that's one reason they talk about doing that. Another reason that you'll find behind that particular reason is when you look at the star Sapatit, which the White Narrow Spring will say Sopadet, or the star Sirius, or Sothis. It's Sapatit, which is star system, the brightest star in the sky. Aset operates through that star. She's called Aset Sapatit. It's like Asar operates through the constellation Sa, which the White Narrow Spring call Orion. And so there's the union of Asar and Aset in the sky, Sa and Sapatit, or Orion and Sirius. And when Asar is operating through Sa, it's Horimet, and we talked about this last week. And Aset is operating through the star system as Sapatit, the queen of Sapatit, the queen of that star system. And she's the queen of Sapatit, or the queen of Sapa, or Shaba, or Sheba. And then you have Asar, who is the Horimet, which is king, chief, he who is above, or leader. Hedi, or in Coptic, Hori. Hori becomes Shori, or Shori, Sholi, Soli, and Horimet, a title of Asar, chief or king of the north. Met is the north. Hori, chief or king, leader, he who's above. Horimet became Shorimet, Solimet, Solimet, Salimet, Solomon, and so forth. So these titles are corrupted from Asar, operating through the star system Sa, Aset, operating through the star system Sapatit, the union of Orion and Sirius, or Asar and Aset operating through these star systems, is the king in the north and the queen of the south, or Solomon and Sheba, who of course never existed also, of any race whatsoever. Star Sapatit rises. There's a couple of risings that are important. The heliacal rising of Sapatit, so-called Sirius, happens in the summertime. That's the beginning of the year with regard to the agricultural year in ancient Kemet. It very rarely rained in ancient Kemet. So it was the river swelling, the inundation of the river that had to do with the total fertility of the land. When the river would swell, overrun the banks, flood the river banks, the whole floodplain. It would last for a number of months. Then the waters would recede. The black silt had been deposited by the river, and then the people would go out and plant their crops after the water had receded, after the long flood, after the inundation. When the star Sapatit would rise in what today's Gregorian calendar around August 5th every year, there's a heliacal rising of Sapatit. That means the star rises in the dawn slightly before the sun rises, so you can see her rising. Prior to that, for about 70 days, you wouldn't see the star. But then 70 days later, then the star shows up again. At its heliacal rising, or helios meaning the sun, heliacal rising, rising before the sun. So in the dawn, before the sun rises, you can see Sapatit, you can see her rise up first before the sun, and that happens around August 5th. That's the beginning of the Renpet, or the new year. So that's a normal beginning of a new year, beginning of an agricultural cycle, because it's beginning, it, announces the beginning of the flood. When the star rises up, they would say a teardrop falls from the eye of Sapatit, which is also called the eye of Ra. Sapatit is the star is the eye of Ra, and of course Aset is his great-granddaughter, so she's his eye. And they talk about you're the apple in my eye, and talk about children like that. The eye of Ra is that star system. It's called the eye of Ra. It's also the star that Aset operates through. They'll say a teardrop falls from that star, which is a great eye, and then falls into the river, and that's why the river overruns its banks and swells up, and there's an inundation that occurs. Now, the teardrop falling into the river is a sanctuary of that divine teardrop, and once it captures that divine teardrop and swells up and overruns its banks, one of the titles of the river Hop is Hop-Reset and Hop-Met, Hop of the south and Hop of the north, two now river divinities. Of course, the term for water in general is Mu. So Mu Hop-Met is the water's Mu of the deity Hop-Met, the deity Hop of the north, the northern Nile. Mu Hop-Met is the waters of the northern Nile, that spirit that operates the waters of the northern Nile. And of course, white Nile Spring had invaded northern Kemet and eventually took over. They knew about Mu Hop-Met, and they manufactured the fictional character Muhammad and said that he was, the one who came at the end, the last prophet coming from the, fake deity of theirs. He comes at the end and, overruns the country with Islam. The river itself, when it receives that divine teardrop of Aset, the tear is called Rem, R-E-M, which means tear. The river is a sanctuary of the tear. Sa means sanctuary or shrine of a deity. This is why the river has the title Sa Rem, sanctuary or shrine, Sa, of the divine teardrop, Rem, of the eye of Ra. So the river is not only Muhammad, but also Sarem. And when the river swells and fills up because of that tear, then it carries the water all the way to the north, of course, and it is a sanctuary of the tear. It brings that divine tear to the whole country. So the river itself is Sarem, a sanctuary of the tear. So Muhammad, the river, carries that tear. Muhammad carries Sarem. Sarem becomes Salem, or Islam, or Islam. And of course, the root of the term Islam, they'll say it's Salem, S-L-M, Salem. In ancient Kemet, there was no letter L, there was a rolling R. So only when invaders invaded and they had L's in their names, they would be translated in the Medusa with the glyphs of the R. Same in the Akan tradition, the Akan language. So Sarem in ancient Kemet becomes Salem when the invaders come in. So Sarem becomes Salem or Salem, and therefore Muhammad, the waters of the northern Nile, carry Sarem or Salem, the sanctuary of the divine tear. So this is where all of that comes from. All of that corruption comes from. But that heliacal rising of Sapatit before the sunrise, around August 5th in the Gregorian calendar, announces the beginning of the inundation of the river, the swelling of the river, the beginning of the agricultural cycle, the beginning of the new year, the end of one cycle, the beginning of another cycle, with regard to the way agriculture went down in ancient Kamit, which was different from everywhere else because they were totally dependent on the swelling of the river. Other people, it rained in other areas of Afuraitkaitnit, so we could have a different agricultural cycle that we operated. We didn't have rivers overrunning the banks in the country, and we were totally dependent on that. So they had their own way of doing things, and this is why around August 5th that Rinpet, or the new year, began at that point. There's also the midnight culmination of Sapatit. When Sapatit reaches its, highest point in the sky, that happens at the midnight culmination of Sapatit, or Sirius, and that happens now because it shifts and it's continuously moving. The dates continuously move, but at this point, that happens around midnight, the midnight culmination on January 1st. So the midnight culmination of the star Sapatit or Sirius occurs at midnight on January 1st when everybody is celebrating the new year. So you have some of the whites in their offspring say, well, we're not really who think that they're, cultural or deep or something like that. We're not really celebrating the, new year that everybody else is celebrating. We're celebrating the culmination of Sirius, the midnight culmination of Sirius, when she moves into her highest point in the sky on January 1st at 12 a.m. Well, she does move into position at that point. But number one, that's not a new year. That's not a new beginning. That's the deepest, darkest time of the year. If people were really and the key is, when the whites in their offspring say something like that, then you will have Negroes run behind them and repeat that as though it's something intelligent, and then they'll go around teaching people, well, we have an esoteric meaning of the new year, and this really has to do with Sirius. And they'll talk about that as though it was something deep and arcane and sacred and a mystery and all kinds of nonsense, like they got it from a master, quote-unquote, teacher, which is some nonsense as well. But in reality, yes, we recognize the culmination of the midnight culmination of Sapatit. We recognize that that's taking place, but we don't celebrate that as the new year. It's the heliacal rising of Sapatit that we recognize as the Rinpet, or the new year, and that occurs around August 5th. So if we were in ancient Kamit, we wouldn't be waiting until the midnight culmination of Sapatit. We would deal with the heliacal rising of Sapatit. It's connected to the actual agricultural cycle, the infusion of energy around that time. It's the midway point between the equinoxes. A number of different things are going on at that time. This is why we place the New Year's celebrations at that particular time. So anybody trying to give you that information, whether it's dealing with the midnight culmination of Sapatit or, the circumcision of the fictional character Jesus 8 days after December 25th, that has no basis in anything intelligent or anything related to a brand new cycle or a new year. That's nonsensical. There are people on the continent, again, who began to imitate the whites and their offspring, so they will celebrate the new year around January 1st. On January 1st, and of course, a lot of them are Christians and so forth. Some of them follow other dates based on what whites and their offspring are doing. So around Christmas, they're now celebrating Christmas, and sometimes they'll designate that as their new year as well, because the whites and their offspring forced this foolish, doctrine on them. So we just want to get through that. That's the first part of this section. So people understand the real new year is based on a real cycle. And whether it's the cycle dealing with the sun, the equinoxes and the solstices and the agricultural cycle that we can actually identify here where we are, dealing with the new beginnings and the end of a certain cycle, the end of one period, the beginning of a new period, the end of the harvest, the harvest period, which is the end of the growing cycle, the harvesting time, but it's the beginning of the seeding period. We can deal with that the Earth Mother in this region goes through that cycle. We're on the Earth Mother in this region. We go through that cycle. There's a shift in energy within your body between the solstices as well. We take advantage of that ritually as well. So we understand that this is a real time for renewal in September. Some people honor that in March. We have celebrations in September as well as March. We have our Apo in March around the equinox, Ojira in September around the equinox. In the Yoruba tradition, they celebrate the New Year in June, not too far from the summer solstice. But nobody is dealing with the New Year around December 25th, around the winter solstice, unless they've been infected by the whites in their offspring, or January 1st. So we wanted to get through that information. Now, and if there are any questions or comments, I just want to check the chat room right quick before we go to the next piece. Thought I saw a comment. So now, there was a question, why the 90-day difference from the Gregorian calendar compared to our calendar? And I think you're talking about the difference between September 23rd as opposed to January 1st? And maybe I might have answered that. Let me know if I answered that in the context of what I said, because I didn't see your comment until just now. So I may have answered it. If you're talking about the difference between September 22nd and January 1st, so we're talking about the actual cycle, the agricultural cycle, the cycles of the earth in relationship to the positions of the sun, and how we take advantage of the energy, of the equal energy, the equinox, the balanced energy of the earth in September as well as March. But let me know if we answered that question. Okay, another question, how can we deal when we live with relatives who carry on white traditions and have no plans on stopping, and they look at you like you're alien and depriving your kids, making comments like they feel sorry for your kids? Well, we have to understand, of course, that, and the answer is in the question, they're still embracing white traditions. They're still brainwashed, infected with those traditions. And, of course, because of that brainwashing, that's the only reason that they're going to, that's the major reason on the surface why they're affronted by you not participating and not allowing your children to participate and so forth. That's on the surface, that's the reason. So they respond by trying to force you to participate in the nonsense. Under the surface, of course, they recognize that what you're doing is intelligent, and they're still, at this point, too conditioned or too weak and bought into that weakness to step out and do something correct. So they get angry at you for pointing that out in reality. It's very similar to somebody who people hooked on drugs, hooked on cocaine or something like that, and at some point, one of the people were out on the street and they're hanging together and doing drugs. One of them says, I'm not doing this anymore, and they decide they're going to get clean, and they go and they get clean. And then you have a response by the other people who are addicts attacking the individual like, who do you think you are? You're not going to be able to make it. That's stupid. You've been doing this just as long as us. Why do you think, why are you going to change? I mean, they come up with all kinds of reasons to attack the individual who's actually getting clean, whether it was drugs or alcohol or whatever, or smoking weed or whatever, and people stop and say, I'm not going to smoke any weed anymore. I don't want to destroy my brain cells or my sperm and ovum cells, or, develop lung cancer, even though whites in our offspring try to pretend like it doesn't cause that, which, of course, it has 50% more carcinogens in marijuana smoke than regular cigarette smoke. So people are dying of lung cancer every day from marijuana. So when people decide they're not going to engage, the people who are still addicts, drug addicts, alcoholics, they will attack the person who's, trying to get clean. That's a response because in reality you're pointing out just through your behavior, through your change, your reorientation back to reality, you're exposing their weakness. And they get mad, so they lash out at you as opposed to saying, you're doing the right thing, I need to do the same thing that you're doing. And it's the same thing with these holidays when you change your name back to your ancestral name, reclaim your ancestral religion, everything you do is exposing them for continuously engaging in self-destructive, ignorant behavior. They know that you've learned something and gotten back to normal, and you're engaging in intelligent action, and now the spotlight is on the fact, just by virtue of the fact that you've changed course, it exposes the fact that they're still engaged in ignorant behavior. And people don't like to be exposed for being ignorant, so they lash out. It's like placing, all of a sudden, when you switch and get back to normal, even if you're not, focused on trying to force them to do anything, just the fact that you're no longer doing it, now it's like placing a clean glass of water next to a dirty one. When all the glasses of water in the, kitchen were a little foggy, some people were thinking, oh, that's just how the water is. But then when you place a clean glass next to them, then the foggy, dirty water is very apparent. And when people have a spotlight on them, then that's a problem. But what we do is, once we learn what's real, then we incorporate what's real, and that's it. And it doesn't matter what anybody says, what they believe about it, it means nothing. If they want information about it, then we freely give that information to the individuals. If they don't want information about it, they're very resistant, that's their problem. We don't have that problem anymore. That has to do with them dealing with those conditioning. That's their problem because they, number one, have embraced the nonsense, but even when they have been presented with something real, their conditioning has precluded them from, incorporating it at this particular time. Very often what happens is they'll assume that you are, just going through a phase, and at some point you'll be back because they've heard about this before. Maybe some of them have done this before, where they stopped celebrating holidays for a few years, but then at some point they got back into it, and they'll say, well, I went through that phase as well, but you'll see that this is important, and one day you'll come back. People who are serious and intelligent, it's over. So after a few years, or 5 years, or 10 years, or however long it takes, then they realize, wait a minute, they do not participate in this nonsense anymore. And then they're just going to have to deal with that. They're going to have to respect it. They're going to be forced to, because nothing that, they say or do is going to make you participate any longer. Okay. And that's not, that's not your issue. That's not your problem. That's their problem, like we said before. Okay, we're going to take a call, and then we're going to get into this Zodiac information. Okay, so Michelle, you had a question or comment, number 6277.
Oh, Hetep, Michelle, this is Naila. How are you?
I'm good. Hetep, how are you doing?
I'm okay. No, I actually, I wanted to sort of dovetail off of what you were saying about, in response to the person's question about, being in a family or having family that still celebrates, the nonsense and participates in the nonsense. Okay, so I have two daughters, twins, and I'm from Chicago. I live in Texas. And I hadn't been home for a long time, several years back. And I decided to, that it was time to go back to visit. And the best time for me to go was during this time of year, during this so-called Christmas holiday. But what I had to do before I went home, because I come from a really, really big family, and some folks are very conscious, and then some folks think they're conscious, and then some are just absolutely aren't. And surprisingly enough, the one person who was more conscious than anyone was my mother. Even though she didn't really, really have a frame of reference for a lot of African-centered things, but definitely black nationalist. So I had to call one of my nieces and tell my niece to let everybody in the family know that I had changed my name and that I refused to be called by my government/slave name. The only person I would allow to call me by that name, and only up to a certain point, was my mother. So that's my mama. And but everybody else had to call me by my, reclaimed ancestral name. I also had to tell my niece to remind everybody that I am no longer a Christian. I do not celebrate or participate in Christmas just because I'm coming home at that, at this time. doesn't mean that I'm going to participate. Do not buy my daughters any gifts. Do not expect any gifts. Do not expect us to eat dinner with you. We will take our plate and we will go someplace else in the house, but we will not eat at the table with you. We will observe Kwanzaa while we're there, and if anybody wants to participate in Kwanzaa with us, they're fine. They're happy to. They're welcome to. And then also, if anyone wants to give my daughters gifts based on Zawadi for Kwanzaa, it had to be on. We were leaving before. We were coming back to Texas before the last day of Kwanzaa. So, but I just made it clear that no one could give my daughters Kwanzaa gifts on Christmas. It had to be either from the 26th until we left, and they had to be gifts that were cultural, educational, no toys, no, unless they had to be, educational and cultural. And so I gave them all of these parameters. And she went back, and I'm like, and you need to tell them word for word everything I said, because if I get off the plane and the moment somebody says, where's my gift, why you didn't give Mama, bring her, this or that, or why didn't you do this, and this, and I'm getting back on the plane. I meant what I said. And so when I got there, and the niece that I was talking to, her birthday, her Krada, her Odunde is actually on December 25th. And I told her I would give her a gift for her Krada only on Kwanzaa, so I was not going to give it to her on her birthday. And she was fine with that, and everybody was fine. So it was just really, really interesting that as hot-headed and as stubborn as my family is, and I'm an eldest and I'm the youngest in the family, everybody adhered to everything that I said. And so when I came in and even dobaled to my mother, she laughed and freaked out and, thought that was funny, but she was like, what is she doing? Why is she laying prostrate out on the floor? She didn't use the word prostrate, but that's basically what she meant. And my sister told her what it meant. And that was actually the moment that my mother started, like, totally opening up and beginning to re-embrace our ancestral traditions. And unfortunately, 3 years later, she returned to the ancestral realm before she got a chance to take it to the level that we're sure that she would have gone to had she been here longer. So anyway, I just wanted to add that basically we can't be afraid to make sure that our family knows what we will and will not do as far as our ancestral traditions. Because I had one sister friend tell me that she lives here in Austin. She's supposed to be very, very African-centered. And she intentionally used to call me by my slave name, even though she knew what my ancestral name was. And she said that she did that just to see if I would ever compromise and respond to it. But she didn't tell me this until, like, many times after she kept calling me by that old name, because it used to tick me off. And finally I had to pull her aside and say, look, I love you, sis, and I have much respect for you. However, the next time you see me, if you call me by my slave name again, not only will I not respond to you, I'm not going to greet you or speak to you the entire time you're around. And if you do it one more time, I'm going to actually have to cuss you out. And she laughed. She says, no, I was doing that on purpose, and I was actually trying to test and see if you, would actually respond to it, and if you would, acquiesce and respond to your old name. And this, I'm like, but who are you to judge me? Who are you to test me? And you still have your slave name.
Right.
So all of that to say that there are people, and even I was told when I went through mine, because I went through a very, very formal naming ceremony. It was beautiful. There was divination involved and so on, and, well, twice, the first time. And the Yoruba priest who basically presided over the naming ceremony actually said that there are going to be people who are going to test you on purpose. There are people who are going to try you just to see if you will respond to your ancestral name. And you have every right not to respond back to them, especially if they're doing it intentionally. And I was like, there's nobody who's ever going to just intentionally call me by my slave name. Well, of course, it happened multiple times from, over a few years until, folks literally just got it and stopped testing me. And that's what's going to happen when in your family. People are going to test you. He don't really mean that. She doesn't really, that's not serious. That's not real. She'll be doing something else in 2 years. She'll be doing something else, next month. He'll be, he's doing all that African stuff, but watch him, date a white girl. Or, it's like our family and people in our family especially, they will still have that connection to those discarnate spirits that are speaking and whispering to us. I call it the Agent Smith syndrome. And they will test us. And they will, sometimes they don't, it's very intentional, and sometimes it's annoyingly an unconscious plantation mentality reflex. It's people do what they know. And I had a friend who used to say, well, you know too much, or you think you know too much, so don't respond, and you have to stick to your guns, and you also have to set boundaries. So if you have people who celebrate holidays and expect you to be there on Thanksgiving, then either just say no and just be prepared to fall out with those people, or you're like, okay, after you all eat, we'll come by. Because sometimes, grandparents, it's their only time or one of the rare times to see their grandchildren. Go the day before. Go the day after. Go after, like I said, everybody's eaten. Find a way to make yourself comfortable, but also to be respectful of and listen to the ancestral spirit that guided you back to your ancestral traditions in the first place, and find a way around the demands of family if you want to keep peace. If peace is not an issue to you, then just do what you need to do and just, I don't want to say ignore, but just basically hold your ground. Because once they see you holding your ground, and it's usually the older siblings or other family members who are not really, really going to get it, it's going to be the ones coming up, the younger generations. Those are the ones we need to impress upon the most and show them that there is not just a better way, but the right way. And the right way is, like Brother Kwesi said, you need to not be a cultural, traditional crackhead when it comes to, not observing these pseudo-false holidays.
Oh, we appreciate that. That's and I see people in the chat room also appreciating, sharing that information, that detailed information, because a lot of people, they wonder how it can be done. If they've never done it before, and the way people are responding, or they think people will respond, they're like, man, I don't know if I can do this. But as soon as you do it, it changes the whole game. I mean, you'll be you will wonder why you waited so long and why you were apprehensive to, make these declarations. and stick to it. So, I say we appreciate that, sharing that information. It was very good information.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also, you ask yourself why you took so long, but also if you ever have somebody in your family or you yourself, you've gotten married, especially women, and you get married and everybody wants to call you by your maiden name or the name they knew you by, and then you're constantly correcting them about, your married name. Or if you got married and you didn't take your spouse's married name and you correct people and say, no, I'm still, Naila Sankofa. And instead of Naila Jones. I'm sorry. Why would you go backwards?
Right.
Why would you go backwards? You gave up your slave name, and then you're going to take somebody else's slave name because you got married to them. I'm sorry, that happened to me when I was engaged, and the brother was really shocked. I was like, I am not taking the last name Johnson. Why would I take that name? So it's the same difference. But anyway, let me let you go ahead and get on to the Zodiac, and and I'm going to keep listening.
Okay, we appreciate it. All right, that's it. Okay, and as we were, as Naila, Naila, because Iya is Yoruba term, Nana is the Akan term for elder, elderess, or, I know Sister uses both because she has both Yoruba and Akan ancestry, but it's Nana, Iya, Naila. As she was saying, and as she was talking about that, it reminded me because she talked about boundaries. And there's another aspect of it when you're dealing with, on one hand, with siblings, parents, grandparents, cousins, and so forth, and your own children or whatever. You do what you need to do, like we were talking about, like Naila was talking about. But also then the boundary with regard to children in another regard. Say, for example, a sister has a son and daughter, she's married, but then they separate and they get a divorce, and they have their own dwelling places now, and sometimes she has the children with her based on the court order on certain holidays or weekends or whatever, and sometimes the father has the children with him. Very often, if the split was based on culture and things like that, or the father is not involved in anything cultural and the mother is, and she's trying to raise her children based on that, and he fell back into going to church or something nonsensical like that, very often they will try to use the children and get back at the parent, or they're just brainwashed and they want to participate in the nonsense. So they will make sure the child goes to church, or make sure the child goes to, all of these white holidays and participate in all of them, even after years of, them not doing that when they, when the people were married. So people are asked the question, well, what does the sister do when she's been raising her children since birth to not participate in that nonsense? And they were very happy to have their own culture and their own holidays and not having to do. They were glad that they were different from everybody else who didn't have their own holidays and were following the white Narrow Spring. They're like, we have our own. We have our own New Year. We have our own celebrations. We do our own thing, and they're very proud of that. And now the other parent is trying to drag them into it. And the bottom line is, if there's a situation where, there's certain that parent is entitled to have the children, and it's the kind of parent that's obstinate, and they're going to do whatever they want to do, and even they're doing certain things in a spiteful fashion, it's very similar to other similar situations in that kind of relationship dynamic. When you have your children with you, then you fill them up with the culture, and you fill them up with the details and everything else, and you give them everything they need. So when they go with the other parent, and they participate in things that are, nonsensical, as they get older, they will recognize and be able to identify why these things are nonsensical, and they'll get to the point where they don't want to have anything to do with it, and they will express that to the parent. But as long as you make sure you do what you need to do while they're with you, it's a waste of time to, at some point, to continue to go back and forth with the other parent. As long as they're with you, you fill them up with what's supposed to be in them, what they should know, what the NSMA for guiding you to place in them consistently. And when they go with the other parents, again, it's going to be a sharp contrast. A clean glass of water next to a dirty one, and they will be able to identify that, and they will respond to that. So you just move forward in that direction, and the Nsamanfo will smooth that out to the point where they will start requesting in various ways, I don't want to have anything to do with that. Can we do something else? And at some point, that other parent is going to realize that conditioning, that brainwashing is breaking up. It's falling to the wayside, and it's not a fad. This is who they are, and nothing is ever going to change that. So then, other decisions will be made. So we just wanted to put that in there. All right. So we dealt with the fictional New Year. Of course, last week we, destroyed the whole Christmas nonsense and the fact that, showed that Jesus never existed and so forth. Now we want, in connection with the so-called New Year, we're going to look at this Zodiac. So, of course, we are the people who charted the constellations. We, understood which abosom operate through these constellations. So, of course, the Seba or Sebao, the stars, or Nsoroma, in the Akan language, the stars are great suns. Oriya, Aten, Atenu, great suns. Just like the physical body of the sun radiates that fiery energy, just like you have a physical body and you radiate heat as well. But your Sumsum, your spirit body, animates your physical body. You are a Sumsum operating through a physical body, and the various stars have abosom that animate or operate through the physical body of those stars. This is the basis of, zodiac signs and these various things and influences that constellations will have, because the abosom operating through that constellation, that infusion of energy is a certain kind of energy coming from that constellation, which is, and its position different than a different constellation positioned somewhere else in relationship to the sun, in relationship to the planet. And when the constellation shows up over the horizon and when it disappears and what time of the year it happens and so forth. But the key is there are abosom operating through these stellar bodies. And we recognize these different constellations or arrangements and the abosom that animate those arrangements. When you look at Adinkra symbols in the Akan tradition, and many of the root Adinkra symbols you'll find in the Medutu, the hieroglyphic symbols of ancient Kemet. You see Veves drawn in Vodun in similar symbols as well. Those constellations, natural constellations, whether it's an Adinkra symbol, if you look, of course, at snowflakes, you'll see their geometric patterns are very precise, ornate, and so forth. These geometric patterns manifest because of the energy moving through space. And energy moves in a harmonious fashion, and they generate harmonious patterns that include the patterns of stars, their placement in the form of these constellations, their placement in the black substance of space. So these arrangements, just like an Adinkra symbol, just like any geometric pattern, when life force energy circulates through and continues to whip through a circle, it creates a certain field of energy. When it moves through an octagon or a square or different things, it creates a different configuration of energy that emanates from it, any geometric form. The same thing with these constellations. They're made up of, stellar bodies that are constantly emanating energy, but because of their position and because of the arrangement, then the life force energy emanating from them is different than other constellations because they're arranged differently. And as the energy of Ra and RA-RAIT, which animates all created things and creation, moves through these arrangements, it's the same as when the energy of Ra and RA-RAIT moves through the geometric pattern of a Adinkra symbol or Medutu, a hieroglyphic symbol. And once that energy is radiating from that symbol based on its geometric form, then it affects our spirit in a specified fashion. That's the basis of zodiac signs and their influence upon us, how they influence us. No different than the sun influences us when it's hot outside. When you go outside when it's overcast and there's less solar energy, there's a different kind of influence, and that's very easy to determine. Or when the moon is full, feeling that magnetism of the moon, the difference between a new moon and a full moon, that's more easy to determine. But then the stars, and many of them much greater and bigger than our star, our sun, they have effects on our bodies as well as the planets and so forth. So when you look at, originally when we charted these things, recognize the abosom that animate them, communicate with these abosom, and begin to make, decisions based on their placement, this is where that science comes from. Now, the whites and their offspring learned about that from our people. They focus on the constellations themselves, their position, certain things they learned about them by observing what our people were doing and reading the records of our people, and then they will simply repeat what was told. In reality, the abosom that govern these different constellations, they have an influence on you, but their influence is not determinate with regard to what your function in creation is. It's influential, but it's not determinate. What determines your function in creation is the abosom that governs your head region, which is the Kradin bosom in the Akan tradition, the Orisha that governs your head in the Yoruba tradition, the Selido and Vodun and so forth. But the divinity that governs your head, the abosom that governs your patriclan, and the abosom that governs your matriclan, and those three, for example, in our Akan culture, the Etch abosom, the patriclan abosom, the Abusi abosom, the matriclan abosom, converging in connection with the abosom that governs your head, and encoded within that is your specific function to execute in the world, your spirit's brain, so to speak, that force of nature that dwells in the head region, which we call Okra and Okrawa, which is Ka and Kaeda in ancient Kemet, Ori Inu in Yoruba, Sebirio in Vodun, encoded within your spirit's brain, your soul, your divine consciousness, your Kra, your Krawa, is the function you have to execute in the world. And then give assign certain forces in creation that give you the kind of energy you need in order to execute that function. So you're given a function to execute in creation, and you're given a specific configuration of energy so that you can execute that function. And as we always talk about, as Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people, we are cells within the great divine body of the Supreme Being. So your heart cells, they serve heart functions. That's what they came into being to do. And when they execute heart functions and support heart functions, they support the whole being at the same time. And just like your cells are children of the organs, but quote-unquote grandchildren of you as a great being, we are children of certain organs within the great divine body of the Supreme Being. The organ that we're a part of is the abosom that governs us. And when we serve that abosom, we're serving the whole great divine body at the same time. So, the specific abosom that governs your head region that was assigned to you pre-incarnation, before you even were sent into the womb, that is the abosom that's determinate with regard to your behavior and what you need to be dealing with, and whatever echiwadi or taboos are associated with that energy complex you need to observe. The other abosom connected to the constellations are influential, but they are not determinate. So your whole life isn't dependent upon the abosom that govern the constellation. They're influential, and you can draw energy from them and learn certain things and get some guidance, but the key is what abosom governs your head and came into the world with you. That's the key. So the whites and offspring, of course, have no connection to any deity at all. So when they copy and write down different things and, invade cultures and so forth, invade our societies, and continue doing what our people are doing, then they just mimic what our people are doing, but then they can't make the proper adjustments because they're not really dealing with the abosom. So when things change, they can't see the changes, so things get stuck in time. For example, when you look at the Zodiac, and of course, you see the Zodiac of Dendera in ancient Kemet. They'll talk about the Babylonians, which really the people of Sumer, which were Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people who migrated from Kanat, which is Nubia, through Kemet, and went up into Kanana, which is Canaan, which is later Palestine and Israel and so forth, went into Akkad, later called Akkad, the Akkad civilization, Akkada. So the Kanat people of Nubia, Kanat is ancient title of Nubia, Kanat or the Kanit land. They migrated up, established Canaan in one area, in Kanana, which they call Palestine and Israel. They also established Akkada or Akkad in Sumer, the same quote-unquote Nubians or Kanitu people who were in Kana, Nubia, the same people who established that civilization in quote-unquote Babylon or Sumer or whatever. So when they talk about, whoa, the Egyptians didn't establish, the Zodiac, it was the people of Sumer. Well, the people of Sumer are the people who migrated from Kana, Nubia through Kemet and established the same culture, and this is why they're the same abosom that they still worship and continue to worship. The whites and their offspring learn about things from the Babylonians and learn about things from the Egyptians, quote-unquote, the people of Sumer and the people of Kemet, and then they continue in the Greek, after the Greek invasion of Kemet and into the Roman invasion and so forth, they continue to, put out carvings and things like that when they were still imitating us, the Greeks imitating the people of ancient Kemet, the Romans also imitating the people of ancient Kemet, whether it's dealing with burial, building temples and everything else, until they started forcing Christianity on the people and then changing everything around and destroying temples and destroying images of deities and everything else. Before they got to that point, they were still imitating what we were doing, but in that imitation, of course, they are corrupt, so they can't communicate with the abosom when it's time to establish a temple or renew something like we would normally do when the whites and offspring try to engage in that similar process. They can't do things properly. So, for example, they didn't understand the precession of the equinoxes. Of course, our people did. So when they look at the position of the constellations that happened that were in position thousands of years ago when the whites and their offspring invaded, well, things have shifted. The position of the Earth with regard to precession, and it's the equinoctial point of the sun with regard to the precession, because the Earth is wobbling as well as spinning. That changes the Earth's position with respect to the constellation. So a few thousand years ago, at the equinoctial point of the sun on March 21st, it was in the constellation of Aries, so-called Aries. But because of the wobbling motion of the Earth, it takes the Earth 26,000 years to make a complete circle, like the pole to make a complete circle in the black substance space, or the so-called heavens. We're in the midst of that 26,000-year cycle, like we said at the beginning, hence the years beginning with 13,000. So this is our year 15, which started on September 22nd, the first day of our Akwamu New Year. Because we're in the midst of that cycle and because things have shifted the position of the Earth with regard to the sun and the other constellations, now the equinoctial point on March 21st, is not in Aries. In fact, it's in Pisces. So, when you look at a tropical zodiac, the typical zodiac that you see in the papers, in the newspapers and so forth, 89% of the dates are inaccurate. If you look at where the stars are now and the Earth's relationship to those constellations, 89% of all of those dates are inaccurate. So every time when somebody says, I'm a Scorpio, I'm a this, I'm a that, then 89% of them are off. This is why people have, varied results when they're getting charts and everything else. So we put a link, and we'll put the link back up. And you can find this anywhere, many different places on the net. If you just Google astronomical zodiac as opposed to astrological zodiac, you'll get proper dates based on the position of the constellations, where they are actually in the sky at different times of the year. So just like our people would go out, how did we find out where the stars were? We looked up in the sky. We had observatories. And we would take notes, and those meticulous notes were taken, written down, carved, and you'll find them in the papyri of ancient Kemet, in temples in ancient Kemet. We've simply observed, and we've continued to observe. And you can observe now, and you can get telescopes now, and you can sit down, and you can chart, and you see when the star constellations rise and when they set, and their different positions, and you can verify that simply by observing. You can observe every day of the year, or you can look on a computer simulation, or you can look at some of the, sites that already have the specific dates or whatever, but it's simply through observation. So when you look at these different signs, what you'll find is, number one, as we said, 80% of them are off. There are not 12 different constellations that cross the ecliptic every year. That was happening back then because of the position of the sun, the Earth with regard to the sun, but because of the wobbling motion of the Earth, now there are 13 constellations that cross the ecliptic every year. So there are not 12 quote-unquote months, there are 13 months. That's just reality based on where the actual constellations are when you look up in the sky. Secondly, out of these 13 months, they are not all 30 days each. They vary. 25 days for one of them, 37 days for one of them, 31 days for one, 20, another 37-day one. One is 45 days, for example, Virgo, so-called Virgo or offset. Libra is 23 days. Scorpio is 7 days from November 23rd to November 29th. It's only 7 days. And then the next one is Ophiuchus, 18 days. Sagittarius, so-called 32 days. Capricorn, 28 days. Aquarius, between 24 and 25 days. Pisces, 38 days. And, of course, Aries is 25. Taurus is 37. Gemini is 31. Cancer, 20. Leo, 37. So all of them basically are different lengths. So they're not all uniform. And there are 13 constellations, not 12. So when the equinoctial point of the sun at the vernal equinox, marking the beginning as a starting point. Then at the equinox in the past, it was in Aries. Now it's in March 20th, 21st, or March 19th is in so-called Pisces. So that's the difference. Then there are 13. And you can see why 89% of them are off. Then there are 13. The 13th, quote-unquote, the 13th sign called Ophiuchus. Of course, these are different. It's different than what the White Star Spring say. So let's just go through them and show our bosoms that govern them. And then you'll see, for example, on the Zodiac of Dendera, you'll see the different 12 constellations. At that time, it was still 12 crossing the ecliptic. And they'll have the various ones in the Greeks and Romans and so forth copied off what they saw in the Zodiac of Dendera. So the Aries, they talk about the ram. Of course, the ram is sacred to Amen. Other bosom as well, like Kunwimu, but Amen is sacred to the ram is sacred to Amen. It's an Achineboa animal totem for Amen. And Achineboa animal totem, sacred to an abosom or an Orisha, Vodou, and so forth, that carries the same kind of energy. If it's a fiery divinity, then there's a fiery kind of animal that carries that energy complex. That means the abosom, as well as the NANANOMSOM who are connected to that abosom, will send that animal to bring messages to people at certain particular times, whether it's physically sending that animal or spiritually through dreams or through ritual practice and so forth, whether it's a crow or an eagle or a vulture or whatever it is, your animal totem shows up connected to your abosom at critical junctures in your life to bring you a message from that specific abosom or from that ancestress, or ancestral clan that you come from to bring you or confirm for you something in particular. So these are animal totems, Achineboa, as they're called in the Akan tradition. The ram, the ram, sacred to Amen. The bull, sacred to Ptah. The bull hop, sacred to Ptah, and so forth. Of course, they have Taurus, which just simply means bull. Gemini, the twin, the White Star Offspring, have Castor and Polyps. Of course, the White Star Offspring are always trying to force some dissexual, homosexual nonsense. The twins that we're talking about here in ancient Kemet is Shu and Tafnut, the male and female divinities, Shu and Tafnut. Cancer, of course, they'll show it as a crab. It's really talking about Khepra, the beetle, TWEREDUAMPON in the Akan tradition. Leo, the lion, is talking about, when you look at the Heru Imaket, or the great, human-headed lion divinity, the Heru divinity, this is what we're dealing with. So-called Virgo, the virgin, we're talking about Offset. Libra, the scale, talking about Ma'at. Scorpio, the scorpion, of course, we're talking about Serket, which is a scorpion, abosom, scorpion, quote-unquote, goddess, scorpion, abosom in ancient Kemet. When you look at the sorrows of Aset, so-called Metronic Stele, when Aset goes out and she finds that Heru, baby Heru, has been stabbed to death by followers of Set, and she picks up the baby Heru who has died and begins to cry. Then Nebuchadnezzar comes along, and then the two, Aset and Nebuchadnezzar, are crying, and they're associated with Medit Shema and Medit Met, the goddess of the northern or southern Nile inundation, and Medit Met, the goddess of the northern Nile inundation. The two Medis, or the two Marys, crying over the baby Hainsu Heru, the baby Jesus, or Jesus, Jesus, and so forth. When they're crying about that, then the abosom, the female abosom, Serket, scorpion divinity, comes forward and said, listen, you need to call on Ra to assist. And then Aset calls on Ra. Ra stops the boat of the sun in the middle of the sky and sends Tehuti down. And Tehuti comes down, the angel, quote-unquote, Gabriel comes down and tells them to stop crying, or Mary, don't you weep, all that nonsense, and helps to resurrect Heru. So that whole scene in the Bible about the dead Jesus in the tomb and the two Marys crying, and then the angel comes and says, don't cry, and he's resurrected, and the whole thing. Tehuti assists in the resurrection of the child Heru, and then he resurrects and eventually goes and fights Set along with Heru Behudet and overthrows Set's rule and reestablishes the, sovereignty of Alsar and Aset in the world. And that whole story, after fake Jesus resurrects, and they talk about in the book of Revelation, he's going to come back with the sword dripping and wage war against the enemy and all that nonsense. And in the Quran, they talk about the Mahdi and the Messiah coming back together. That's Heru Behudet and Heru, son of Aset, waging war against Set and his followers. So that's the scorpion, female scorpion abosom, Serket. And they're talking about Sagittarius and the archer. Of course, the great archer, female archer, par excellence, or extraordinary, is the goddess Neat, often spelled Neat with the TH, primordial mother divinity and so forth. Then you have Capricorns, really connected with Kunwimu, as they often call him, Kunum. We did a broadcast dealing with Kunum and the quote-unquote famine stele. You can listen to that. Aquarius, the water bearer, when he has the two vessels of water, pouring the water out into the river, that's actually Hap or Hapi, the abosom of the Nile River, and you'll see Hapi with the two vessels pouring it into the river so that it can make the inundation occur with the masculine energy on that side. Of course, Medit is the female abosom of the inundation of the river and so forth. And then you have Pisces, the two fish. The pilot fish in the boat, for the boat of Ra, are An and Remi. So those are the two fish, and then the White Nile Spring have two other fish. The 13th sign, though, they talk about Ophiuchus, meaning the serpent bearer, and they'll say that's Asclepius, the quote-unquote god Asclepius, the great healer, and he's the bearer of the serpent and so forth, dealing with healing. In reality, Asclepius is a corruption of Imhotep or Imhotep in a later period when Imhotep becomes one of the deified ancestors, so to speak. You have the triad Ptah, Setchima or Sekhmet, and Nefer-Tum. In Min-Nefer, the major triad, Ptah, the creative power, fashioning power, he's a functionary of Ra. Some people will try to equate Ra and Atem and Khepra all together as one deity, different aspects of the same deity. That's idiocy, and we're going to get into that when we talk about the idiocy of monotheism. But Asclepius is a corruption of Imhotep. So at some point you have Ptah, Sekhmet, and Imhotep as the triad. Imhotep will take the place sometimes of Nefer-Tum later on when he's a deified ancestor. So this is where they get Asclepius, the serpent bearer, the great healer, being Ophiuchus. But in reality, it's not Imhotep, that's the White Nile Spring making that association. The real serpent bearer with regard to that triad is actually Sekhmet. And when you see Sekhmet, she has the serpent, the circular serpent on her head. She's the great healer. Not only that, she's a great killer, but she's the divine healer as well, healeress as well. And we have a couple of articles on her at Abinah, Sekhmet, as well as on the OBRADWIRA 3-part series, Sekhmet, the menstruation goddess, because she governs menstruation. So she's a divine killer. She spills blood through warfare. She also spills blood, quote unquote, through menstruation. She's the abosom that governs that. So, but she's a divine healeress. So she has the serpent on her head, the circular serpent. She is the serpent bearer. Her priests and priestesses were called Sunu, meaning physician, because of her function of healing. She'll wage war through fire, but she'll also wage war through epidemics. So you have Patan Sekhmet, male and female balancing. In the Yoruba tradition, you'll have Obaluaye. You also have Iyami Abini. She comes and clears the way, clears the earth of disorder. In the Vodun tradition, you have the Sakbata or Sakmata, Sekhmeta or Sakbata twins, Dazochi and Ananu. This is what you're dealing with. You're dealing with Ptah and Sekhmet. And she brings plagues just like the Sakbata brings plagues. We're talking about the male and female divinity. She uses plagues to destroy. Did that in ancient Kemet, continues to do that today. Also using fire and heat to destroy and so forth. So she's the real serpent bearer. So the 13th sign is not Asclepius, the serpent bearer, or Imhotep, the child, quote unquote, of Patan Sekhmet. It's actually Sekhmet, who is literally the serpent bearer and the divine healeress. So those are the different actual abosom governing the constellation. So want to make sure we didn't miss anything in the chat room. Looks like we have a call, so we're going to take this call, and then we're going to get into the Pseudo-Kemeticism next. Okay, Michio, number 9412, you had a question or a comment? Number 9412. Can you hear us? Okay, so we'll come back. There. So, all right. So what we want to get into right now, we dealt with the real New Year. We dealt with the real Zodiac. So we're going to deal with Pseudo-Kemeticism, because you have a great deal of misinformation, not only regarding the Zodiac and things like that. Doctrines like monotheism, atheism, extraterrestrialism, dissexuality, homosexuality, anthropomorphism, and more. So we can get all of that together at the same time. So, for example, we have our book, KHOPA, Warning, Dissexuality, Homosexuality was never accepted in ancient Kemet. And we'll put a link for that in the chat room. The name of the book is KHOPA, or Warning. And for those who are unfamiliar, we have 15 books, ebook versions as well as the soft cover versions. We publish, of course, and we publish in-house, we print in-house, in color on our own printers. So we create our own books. We write, of course, publish, edit, and so forth, but we don't contract out the printing of our books. We do them ourselves, and we print them in color in-house. Ebook versions of all of our books are free downloads. So you can download all of the books, as well as 60-plus articles and all the broadcast archives and so forth. We have about 75 archives of our show, as well as 60-plus videos where we go into detail examining our publications. Most of the videos are about 2 hours, where we would take one of our books and examine them in detail with these various topics dealing with ancestral religion, culture, nation building. KHOPA is one of these books. We go into detail about the fact that dissexuality, homosexuality was never accepted in ancient Kemet. For example, the two twins, NYANKOPON and KHERER, they try to say were two homosexuals. They're actually identical twins. And we show the medut for the term for twins, hatar, and that medut, the symbols that make up that name, are the two twins who are conjoined in the womb and they're holding hands. That's what the symbol for hatar, meaning twins, is. Of course, in the Akan tradition, the term atar means twins, and it comes from hatar from ancient Kemet, because the twins are conjoined in the womb. So a patron divinity of twins in Kemet is Kunwimu or Kunum, the one who conjoin. His name literally means to conjoin. He fashions the body and the ka, or the soul of the person, on the divine potter's wheel before the spirit is entered into the womb, and he conjoins them in the womb. And his name Kunum means to conjoin, but he's also the one who conjoins the two twins in the womb. So these two twins are Ni-Ankh-Kunum and Kunum-Hetep. They're named after this divinity who conjoined them in the womb. They also have wives and children and so forth. We go into detail about that and prove that in the book. We also talk about the instructions of Ptah-Hetep, that instruction number 35, when they talk about the instruction against sexual activity with a prepubescent female. White and Offspringer try to say that's talking about a prepubescent male or an effeminate male, and they're talking about not forcing yourself on an effeminate male, trying to suggest that in other situations dissexuality was accepted, which is totally false, and we destroy that. We show the Medusa and show the actual culture and prove that linguistically and cosmologically that it's talking about a prohibition against engaging in sexual activity with a female who is not yet a woman. We also have the divine prohibition against dissexuality and homosexuality in the text of Kemet. When you look at the number 11 in the so-called 42 enunciations of Ma'at, when you're invoking 42 different abosom, different divinities, and then you connect with them, and in the process, number 11 talks about, I have not engaged in this sexual activity, not copulated with a copulator. That's right in the text, meaning that if you engage in that, you'll be repelled by the abosom because it's divinely hated by the abosom. They hate this sexuality. This is why it's included as something that you did not engage in, just like you didn't engage in murder, you didn't engage in theft, you didn't engage in all these negative things. You also show that you did not engage in sexual perversity. At the same time, you're showing what you didn't engage in. You also show the positive things associated with those 42 abosom that you live in harmony with. So we have an entire broadcast of 42 enunciations of Ma'at talking about what it's really dealing with is the invocation of 42 deities, abosom, the assessors of Ma'at. It's not just a set of commandments, like some people would like to say, turning, and this is part of that Pseudo-Kemeticism, turning 42 invocations of different male and female forces in nature, just like we would go from shrine to shrine in somebody's house and invoke the Orisha, invoke the abosom at different shrines. They have more than one shrine at their house. You would go to one shrine, invoke the abosom, go to the next shrine, invoke the abosom. After death, we go to these 42 different abosom divinities and invoke them ritually and fuse our energy with theirs. And if we're in harmony with them, we'll be, connected to them. If we were engaged in disorder, then their energy would repel us and we would not be in harmony with them, and therefore we would not pass that test of the weighing of the heart, and we would not be accepted into Asamando. The ancestral realm will be repelled from that, and there will be those kind of discarnate, wayward spirits who are hanging around earthbound, the places where they died or were murdered and so forth, and harassing individuals and suffering in the spirit realm. So we go into detail about that, in that broadcast. So now that's dealing with the dissexual piece, and we go into detail. That book details these, this information, lays it out so it's irrefutable. So you can download that book at any time from our NHOMA page. So that's dealing with the dissexuality piece, and we've destroyed that and addressed it in shows, but that's one of the angles that the whites and our offspring have tried to force into the culture and brainwashed Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people they'll try to say, well, you know, the people of ancient Kemet, they dealt with unconditional love, and they weren't dealing with, you know, rejecting anyone based on something like that. They were spiritual, and it had nothing to do with that, and they accepted everything, and they didn't, you know, judge people. Pure foolishness. So if you have a Negro, whether they're so-called priest or priestess, whether they're involved in ancient, quote-unquote ancient Kemet or any other traditional Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit religion, there's no such thing as unconditional love. That's idiotic. We have our book, Madanechi, Divine Law, or Love and Divine Hate. So we break down the fact that Nyamewa, Nyame, and Sheshe, or divine order, is comprised of two complementary poles. Order, a specific way or structure. Divine law, which is the expression of order, and law and love is the same word, and divine hate, which is the impression of order. So through law, we incorporate those things, objects, deeds, and entities we need to harmonize with divine order, and through hate, we reject, we repel through that force of hate, we repel those things, objects, deeds, or entities that we need to repel that would otherwise make us become imbalanced and out of harmony with order. So just like you have an immune system that rejects cancerous cells to maintain the order or integrity of your body, the divine immune system and lymphatic system is Herubehudet and Sechima, Herubehudet and Sekhmet, called Benna and Abena in the Akan tradition, and Ogun and Iyami Abini in the Yoruba tradition, and so forth. These are the forces of divine hate. We go into detail about that. Even the term hate comes directly from ancient Kemet and is a component part of the descriptive titles of these deities. They have hate in their name. So we prove that. And law and love is the same word. We prove that as well. Law is the expression of order. It expresses the specific conditions imprinted upon creation by the Supreme Being. That's what law or love is. So if that's what it's dealing with, an expression of order, the specific conditions imprinted upon the created order by the Supreme Being, you can't have unconditional law. Law is the basis of that which is conditional. So there's no such thing as unconditional love. And the whites and offspring know that. But they want us to accept them and their rule over us, and they don't want us to embrace divine hate because then we would exterminate them. Whether it was an ancient Kemet, we recognize, of course, enemy, we would wage war against them to exterminate them and to repel them from our country. How can the whites and offspring continue to rule over somebody if they have divine hatred in their heart? Any chance they get, they will seek to exterminate their enemy. This is why they forced Christianity upon us, Islam and various other cultures, to teach us, talk about unconditional love and embracing your enemy and turning the other cheek and all that nonsense. They had to try to deify idiocy, deify acquiescence, because if they did not do that, they recognized that for thousands of years we always waged war against them and typically were successful in crushing them. So this is a new strategy. This is where that nonsense of unconditional love comes from, or God is love comes from. We have our book, Anidaho, which is awareness, and we break down the origin of the term God, which is a title. God is a title of Amen as well as Aminet. We go into detail about that. We also break down the origin of the terms Naga and Negas and Netra in these various terms, Negro, Nigger, Nigga, and everything, showing that, of course, Negro, Nigger, Nigga has nothing to do with Naga, has nothing to do with Negas, has nothing to do with Netra, has nothing to do with divine. There's a lot of misinformed individuals out here propagating idiocy, trying to associate nigger with divine, nigger with Naga, nigger with Negas, nigger with Unger. Totally 100% false. So when you see people talking that nonsense and you can study the actual real details that prove irrefutably that these things have nothing to do with divinity, nigger has nothing to do with divinity, and you get the actual etymological origin of the term God, where it actually comes from, as well as these other terms, and what their actual meaning is, then when you see that these individuals out here doing dissertations about the term nigger and trying to associate it with divinity, are totally 100% wrong in everything that they're saying, then intelligently you're going to have to reassess everything they've ever talked about with regard to ancient Kemet, ancient civilization, philosophy, culture, values, because typically they don't know what they're talking about. They may be PhDs, they may be doctor this, doctor that, they may be initiated, quote-unquote, priests and priestesses or queens, kings, elders, elderesses. All that means absolutely nothing. When they don't know what they're talking about, then they don't know what they're talking about. And you have to assess everything that comes from anyone. And when it can be shown to be inaccurate, you have to make proper decisions. So we get into that in the Anidaho book. There's a couple of things that, have been propagated for a number of years and are continuously propagated. The notion of monotheism and atheism, and ancient Kemet being monotheistic, or ancient Kemet not having any deities, and the so-called deities were just symbols of higher aspects of ourself or anthropomorphized aspects of energy, and we just created stories and things like that. And we've gotten into this in different broadcasts, but number one, with regard to monotheism, they'll point to Akhenaten with regard to monotheism and say he was a monotheist. Totally inaccurate, but that's what they would say. Everything they say with regard to Akhenaten being a monotheist is based on a couple of documents. The Great Hymn to the Atem, the short version and the long version. And that's really it. And there are many copies of that in different areas, like in the Armana areas and so forth. But the couple of hymns to the Atem is where they base all of that. So when the White Offspring first uncovered the hymns to the Atem, he was talking about the Atem, the great one, and everything else, they started putting forth the false notion that he was being a monotheist because he destroyed the carvings of the names of some of the other deities and elevated the Atem to, the abosom that he was going to focus on more so than other divinities. So the White Offspring jumped out and said, hey, monotheism began in ancient Kemet, trying to corrupt the culture of ancient Kemet. No person from ancient Kemet or any Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit person just in general is stupid enough to believe in the idiocy of monotheism, because we can actually communicate with the Great Father and the Great Mother directly. So we know who Amen is, we know who Amenet is, we know who their grandchildren are, which is Ra and RA-RAIT, the Creator and Creatress, who are servants of Amen and Amenet. We know there's a difference between the Supreme Being, Amen and Amenet, and the Creator and Creatress, Ra and RA-RAIT. And they are the grandchildren of Amen and Amenet. The father of Ra is Nu, and RA-RAIT as well, and the mother of Ra and RA-RAIT is Nunet. So you have Nun and Net, or Nu and Nut, the mother and father of Ra and RA-RAIT. But Amen and Amenet is the grandmother and grandfather of Ra and RA-RAIT, and they direct Ra and RA-RAIT to create the universe. So the Supreme Being directs the Creator and Creatress. There's a delineation between these different entities. We know that because we communicate with them. They still possess us and communicate directly with us. We have a book, NYANKOPON-NYANKONTON, Ra and RA-RAIT, showing that in NYANKOPON and in NYANKONTON in the Akan tradition is Ra and RA-RAIT the same divinity. And we also talk about Da and Idahuedo in Vodun, the rainbow serpent, swallowing its tail, male and female, creator and creatress of the universe. The same thing with NYANKOPON and NYANKONTON, the great circular serpent, operating through the rainbow, creator and creatress of the universe, progenitor and progenitress of Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people. You'll see Ra and RA-RAIT in ancient Kemet, operating, circling the sun, the creator and creatress, swallowing their tail, the progenitor and progenitress of Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people. You see Odumare and Oshumare. Oshumare is shown as a, encircled serpent, rainbow serpent, swallowing the tail, creatress of the universe. And of course, Odumare is the creator, often called Olodumare or Eledumare. Olorun is the great father, but Olodumare is the creator, in the same position of the dynamic between Amen and Ra. Olodumare is not just another name of Olorun. Monotheism has infected many Yoruba people through Islam and Christianity, and they've tried to force-fit different deities to make them just different aspects of Olorun, which is inaccurate. And the same as occurred in the Akan tradition, they'll try to say that Nyankompon is just a name of Onyame, which is totally false. Nyankompon is a grandchild of Onyame, just like Ra is a grandchild of Ra, of Amen. And Ptah is subordinate to Ra, and so is Atem and Khepra. These all are different deities. So we have books dealing with them in detail. Why do we know what we know with regard to that in traditional culture? Because in traditional culture, we communicate with the Abosom. Yoruba people were not infected with Islam, and Akan and other individuals, Ebe, Vodun, Phone, and so forth. We still get possessed by Da and Idafuedo, or Nyankopon and Nyankonton, Ra and RA-RAIT. We know who they are because they communicate directly with us. The whites and their offspring don't have that capacity because they don't have a Kra or Krawa, so they can't communicate with them. And they're angry over the fact that they can't and we can, so they would rather us not communicate with the actual forces in nature and embrace false philosophy that will keep us impotent. So Negroes reading what the whites and offspring said about the great hymn to the Atem, the short and long version, because white people said he was monotheistic, then Negroes just ran out and said he was monotheistic. Ask yourself, have you ever read the great hymn to the Atem? Or the short version or the long version? You can get it anywhere on the internet. Download copies of the hymns to the Atem found, in Armana, and you'll see that he doesn't just mention the Atem. He also mentions Ra. He also mentions Khepra. He also mentions Hapi, different divinities, because they never stopped communicating with these different divinities. Only an idiot would assume that there was monotheism in Kamit. The people who actually practiced the culture were getting possessed by Abosom. They know who these deities are. They don't just disappear because you come up with a new philosophy. These are the forces in nature that impact you on a regular basis and directly manifest themselves to you through the bodies of the people, at the shrine, in ritual, and so forth. So if no black person is foolish enough to embrace some nonsense about monotheism unless they've rejected their own culture and don't deal with the Abosom because they become repulsive to the Abosom. That also gets to, so you'll have a number of so-called Afrocentric scholars and teachers and so forth proud of saying, well, Akhenaten was the first monotheist, as though monotheism is the highest level of spiritual development and polytheism is inferior. In reality, monotheism is idiotic, and it's not even on a level. You can't even call it the lowest level because it's not spiritual development at all. It's idiotic. It's nonsensical. When you have direct experience with actual divinities, you know that there's more than one. So the people who still worship the whites and their offspring and see their own culture as inferior and primitive, and they're ashamed of their own culture, still brainwashed by the whites and their offspring, then they want to say, well, they want to be proud of monotheism because they think that's the highest level of development. They want to associate it with our people and say, see, we even came up with monotheism. Look at these texts. But they didn't read the text fully. They didn't even give a cursory, study of the text because all the various Abosom are still there. So that destroys the whole notion of monotheism simply by reading the only couple of texts that exist that white people laid all these, this foundation for monotheism upon in their own minds, the great hymns to the Atem. Study them and you will find them. That gets to atheism. Now, before we go forward, there are 4 minutes and 30 seconds left in the live broadcast online. If you want to continue to listen past 11 o'clock, you must call in within the next 4 minutes. The call-in number is 657-383-0635. 657-383-0635, and you have about 4 minutes to call in. Otherwise, if you're just listening online, then you won't be able to hear after 11, but everybody on the phone will still be able to hear and be able to ask questions and so forth. So 657-383-0635, and you have a little bit less than 4 minutes to call in. All right, so then we get to this notion of atheism. So you have Negroes coming at that in different ways. Some will say that, people in ancient Kemet never had any deities at all, and all of the deities on the walls and everything else and all the rituals they engaged in, all of that was pure symbolism, and it just represented, quantum physics and scientific principles, and that was it. And some people would be foolish enough to say, well, the people were just very superstitious and they had these little beliefs, and at some point they fell away from these beliefs. This is what people are saying. Once again, you have people who worship the whites and their offspring. Beyond any titles they give themselves, beyond anything they say about themselves, about how culturally grounded they are, Afrocentric scholars, PhDs, making up priestesses and all kinds of things. Beyond all of that, the reality is they hate their own culture because they worship the whites and their offspring. They feel their own culture is primitive or inferior, and white pseudo-culture and pseudo-metaphysics is superior, and they're enamored with that nonsense because of self-hatred. So they would try to twist real religion into that nonsense. When you actually invoke the abosom and are possessed by them or communicate with them through divination in various ways, which all Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people can do, then you actually have direct experiential knowledge. So, for example, you can ask any of these individuals, who taught our people writing? How did we learn about the Medutu, how to create these symbols and what they mean? The people of ancient Kemet themselves, and if you respect your ancestresses and ancestors and what they actually said, what they wrote on the walls, they said that Tahuti as well as Seshat, the male and female great forces of divine wisdom, as well as divine scribes, they taught our people the Medutu, taught us how to write, and taught us what these symbols meant. And once they taught us what these symbols meant, and we continued to use them, and that was the writing system. That's what our people said. The whites and their offspring will come by, read that, and say, no, that's not what happened thousands of years ago, because these deities don't exist. What really happened was this. So they're going to reject everything that our people said. The same people built these great civilizations, the pyramids that they're tinkering around with, digging up things, trying to figure out how we built and did what we did. They're going to decide, no, that's not what happened. What really happened was this, and this was just symbolic. Of course, the whites and their offspring are criminal. And again, you have about 50 seconds to call in, 657-383-0635. 657-383-0635. And about 40 seconds left before the only people who will be able to hear is on the phone line. So, of course, the whites and their offspring are criminal. So they're going to lie about the culture because they want you to not pay attention to the abosom. When they try to communicate with you or possess you or show you things, in your conditioned mind, you'll say, oh, no, I didn't hear that. Oh, that's probably not anything. Oh, I shouldn't listen to that. That's the devil. Anytime you get a communication from an abosom or the Nsamafo, they want to have brainwashed you sufficiently for you to either ignore it, reject it, or if it's so wrong where you can't ignore it and you can't reject it, then you'll say it's the devil, or you'll say I'm schizophrenic, or it's something wrong with me, or I'm making up things in my mind, or that was just a coincidence. That's what they want you to get into. All right. So the whites and offspring are going to lie, but the Negroes who hate themselves, they will mimic what the whites and offspring say. They don't have enough respect for the ancestral culture to actually embrace their own ancestral culture that's an inheritance of ours that comes through our blood circle. They don't deal with that. If they did that, that's more rigorous, like studying Adebisa, studying divination, real divination. That's more rigorous than sitting around in some classes, listening to some of the whites and their offspring, memorizing what they teach you, regurgitating it at test time, then getting a degree in memorizing what the whites and their offspring have said, or reading what they've said, and getting a master's degree, and then, writing a thesis and getting a PhD based on misinformation that the whites and their offspring have put forward That's not rigorous. You're just reading, memorizing, writing, memorizing, and regurgitating misinformation. So, but it's more rigorous when you have to actually commit yourself to study with regard to adebisa, with regard to actual divinatory practice. That's much more rigorous. It affects you on a physical level, the physical energy, spiritual energy, and so forth, and just being able to attune to the reality, attune to the detailed information, the abosom that govern creation, what's being communicated, is it proper, what kind of medicine may someone need, whatever it is, it's much more rigorous, it's much more detailed. That's real study. Many of our people who claim to be so-called scholars, they'll sit around and study some nonsense the whites and offspring put forward, but they're too lazy to actually engage in ritual practice and actual real study, because the central institution of learning in our culture is the ancestral shrine as well as the shrines of the abosom. They're not going to engage in that because it's too rigorous. So they'd rather just imitate the whites and offspring, regurgitate what they say, blacken it up, tweak it a little bit, make it sound black, and then say this is what our ancestors and ancestors were teaching. So some of these Negroes will say, if you ask them, the queens, kings, queen mothers, so-called elders, so-called eldresses, so-called priests, so-called priestesses, so-called linguists, so-called scholars, PhDs, whatever they want to call themselves, who claim to be talking about ancient Kemet. Ask them, put the question to them, who taught the people of ancient Kemet writing? How did that happen? And look at what they've said today, even beyond asking them, just look at what they've said about it up until this point, up until today. They have a record online of, talking about different things, or they have publications, or they have radio shows, or they have, podcasts, or they have videos, or they've done YouTube videos or whatever, or done presentations and put forward papers. Ask them who taught writing to our people. Where did the Medutu come from? And they will mimic exactly what the whites and their offspring say. Now, anybody who's done real ritual and been invoked the abosom and the Nsamafo, you will understand when our people said that Tahuti and Seshat taught us writing, you'll understand exactly what they mean. Because when you engage in ritual practice, if you're at an Akom, a ritual practice in the Akan tradition, or a Bembe, for example, in the Yoruba tradition, when Orisha possesses, or one of the Egungun possess, or one of the Abosom possess in the Akan tradition, or one of the Nsamanko possesses, they get inside of the body of the person and communicate to the community through the body of the person. They will direct somebody to go get them a stick, and they will be outside and they will draw symbols in the dirt or in the sand and point to the symbol, say a name, and encourage you to say the same name. And then you know what that symbol is, what the name of that symbol is, and what it represents. They'll draw another symbol. People who engage in the culture, this is common. This is exactly when they say Tahuti taught us writing, Seshat taught us writing. This is a literal thing. The Abosom possess, draw these symbols in the sand, and show us what the name of that symbol should be. And from that point on, we're going to use that symbol. And all the symbols they gave us, the hundreds of symbols they gave us and told us what the names of these symbols were, we continue to use them, write them, pass on that knowledge intergenerationally. This is where we get our writing system from. That's just one example. So you ask these Negroes these things who claim to be experts now. They'll claim to be master teachers, talking about they've gone back and forth through the continent, so they know whether it's West Afuraitkaitnit or South or Kemet. They'll tell you all kinds of reasons why they have credentials. Up until this point, look at their track record of how they've answered these questions. Because some of them are savvy enough to have listened to some of our broadcasts when we brought this information up, and they'll try to incorporate this now into what they're teaching. But they have a record on the Internet. That's the problem for some of these individuals with the Internet, that they've immortalized their ignorance on the Internet when they were trying to promote themselves as, experts in the culture. But they've immortalized the falsehoods that they were teaching, and anybody can access that. So look at what they've been teaching up to this point. And you'll see, and when you ask that question, they'll say, well, these deities, they didn't really teach us writing. This is just representative of the transfer of knowledge and, symbolism and all of this nonsense. Everything that the whites and our offspring say, they mimic. And that's just one clear example. And it cuts across the board. We learn directly from the Abosom through possession, Akom, through spiritual communication, Unkom, whether it's through various forms of divination, coming at the shrines to us with children as well as adults, teaching us, showing us things, and those things manifest, and we can confirm what they taught us spiritually in the physical world when these events take place exactly as they taught us or had shown us. So that destroys this notion. That's just one example, but not only destroys the notion of monotheism, but the idiocy of atheism. The whites and their offspring want to either make us believe that all of the forces in nature, for the receptive people who actually pay attention and respect the Abosom and respect the Unsamanfo, whether they're children or adults, then when the Unsamanfo and Abosom, the ancestors and the divinities, communicate with them, they respect that and they want to pay attention. Some of our people will say, well, it's happening, but that's the devil. And they only want to focus on the fictional cartoon character Jesus or the fictional cartoon character Allah or Yahweh or whatever. But then you have people who have cut themselves off from that kind of receptivity, and the whites and their offspring get to them by saying, well, actually, there were really no deities at all. They don't exist. All of those are just symbolic representations of different aspects of creation, anthropomorphized, aspects of creation, meaning turning them into male and female forms, human forms, and so forth. You therefore have anthropomorphized your God. So when you hear somebody say, people of ancient Kemet anthropomorphized their divinities, meaning they anthropomorphized nature or made nature into an anthropo or a man, or male or female or a being, a human being. So when they talk about Al-Sar, for example, or Al-Set, Nebuchadnezzar, and they show what they look like and show what Al-Set looks like and Het-Heru and so forth, our people weren't just sitting around drawing pictures trying to, talk about nature and science in a symbolic way and therefore came up with little stories to explain scientific principles. We can come up with that and do little things like that and create tales and things like that. But when it comes to the Abosom themselves, the reason we drew them in a certain form is because that's the form they show up in. That's how they manifest to us. And when we see them, just like you see a person walking in your house, when the Abosom show up at the shrine, then we draw the picture of them exactly how they directed us to draw it, as well as how they manifest it to us. Because we can see them, we can communicate with them. And even people who don't know each other, they can describe the same divinity, from a distance. Even if they're in different cities and never communicated with one another over years and met for the first time. And they'll sit down and talk about this specific Abosom, with divinity came to me and they were dressed like this and they did this and said this. And the person who lived hundreds of miles away from them in a different city and never met before, they'll tell them about the exact same experience they had with a similar divinity, with the same divinity, because the Abosom are real. The same thing happens to black people in America. They will have dreams, we'll have experiences with Abosom at our shrines. Then you read something on the continent, about the culture on the continent, specific things, unique, peculiar things, and you'll find out the same deity with the same ritual colors, with the same name, has been communicating with you exactly as they were communicating with the people on the continent. Where there are specific ritual practices based on your clan that's different from somebody else's clan in your same ethnic group, but even amongst the clans there are differences and taboos. The Unsamafo will tell you not to do a certain thing or to do a specific thing. And then you'll find out later that the people of that clan on the continent, they were told to do specific things. We talked about the Asona Abusia in the Wenchi region or in the Sepui region early in the broadcast. Still continue and practice the Apo observance around March and April just like the Bono Akan do in the Bono region. Some of those individuals migrated from the Bono region and went west and established themselves in the Set-Free region, but all of the Akan in the Set-Free region don't practice the Apo observance, but the Asona Abusia, the Asona clan amongst those people, they still practice Apo. So, of course, one of the reasons we talk about that trucery on the site when we're talking about the Apo festival, but one thing that's connected with regard to us is we are from Asona Abusia, and our Nsamafo directed us to, practice and reestablish the Apo observance here in America, because all Akan people don't do that, some Akan people do. After engaging that for a number of years, we would later find out that it was the Asona Abusia, out of all the other 6 clans, it was just the Asona Abusia who continued the practice of Apo when they separated from the larger Bono Akan group. And just like that happened on the continent, and the Asona people continued to practice Apo, well, our Nsamafo, who are Asona, they directed us to continue to reestablish Apo here in America, exactly the way they did before. So that was a particular thing specific to the Asona people in that region who left the Wenchi region and so forth. So, and there are other things as well. But the Aboso and Nsamafo will give you direct instructions on specific things specifically related to your clan. And then you will find out later the clan on the continent does the exact same thing because you have the same ancestresses and ancestors who are communicating with you that are communicating with them because you're the same people. You're cousins as well, and you share the same ancestry. So what that does is that kind of information, and it cuts across the board. There are all kinds of examples of that in your own life when you pay attention. And the more you pay attention, you establish your ancestral shrine and start engaging the Nsamafo, the NANANOMSOM on a consistent basis, whatever that is, whether it's every single day or every other day, whatever schedule you establish with your ancestresses and ancestors, your NANANOMSOM, spiritually cultivated Nsamafo, whatever schedule you establish with them, whatever time frame, whether it's 10 minutes or 15 minutes a day, whatever it is, as long as you keep that schedule you establish with them, however that schedule manifests is different for different people. The more consistent you are, the more information you receive. Just like if somebody wants to learn something detailed from you, it will take a great deal of time for you to give them the information. If they came every day at the same time, ready with their, information, with their pad and pen or with their tablet or whatever, ready to take notes, or if you found somebody else who would come one day, then they'd disappear for 5 days and show up one day and then they have to leave early or show up 6 days later, you're not going to spend a great deal of time trying to give that individual a great deal of information because they're not going to do anything with it. But the person who shows up every single day at the same time, ready, then you're going to give them information because they're consistent and they're sincere. And when you show that consistency and that sincerity with regard to the NANANOMSOM, they will give you that information and make it clear, crystal clear, and allow you to, confirm that in the course of your everyday life tangibly. So you'll know what you receive spiritually manifests tangibly, and is proved tangibly. This is the way they operate. And you can ask them to do so. So that whole notion of atheism, and we were just creating symbols and anthropomorphizing deities and all of that nonsense, that again comes from individuals who are not really dealing with the Aboso, not really dealing with the Nsamafo, the Ntoru, the so-called Neteru, Netetu. They're not possessing, they're not communicating. And therefore they fall into the false definitions because of their lack of capacity to communicate. They'd rather say that divinities don't exist instead of saying, I can't communicate with them because I've made myself repulsive because I've embraced the culture of the white neural spring. Once you get back to normal, you're like that magnet that, is pulled across the table and jumps to the other magnet. Once you get in harmony with the Aboso, when you decide to reverse that polarity, then you become repulsive. So even if you get near to them, you're repulsed. You're not able to hear or receive what they're trying to transmit because you're rejecting in favor of embracing the whites and their offspring because of ignorance. But when you reject that, you become automatically receptive and attractive to the abosom and the nsamapo. So when you engage those kind of practices on a consistent basis, you know who the abosom are. Atheism is idiotic. So whenever you hear somebody talking about that, they're either deliberately lying to you because they're agents of the whites and their offspring, which is a smaller percentage, or the large percentage are just individuals who are engaged in self-hate, and they cloak their self-hate. They're savvy enough to not say, listen, we think the whites and their offspring are superior. You can't say that if you claim to be Afrocentric or about African culture or restoring our people to their greatness and all the different things they say. You can't admit that you think black culture is inferior and white culture is superior and you still worship the whites and their offspring. You can't say that. So what you'll say is, well, actually, the way we've been studying these things are wrong, and in reality, these were just symbols, and you start going through all the foolish explanations that are given by the whites and their offspring. You try to blacken them up, whether it's evolution, being descended from a common ape-like ancestor, that kind of nonsense, or atheism, or monotheism, whatever it is. This is coming directly from the whites and their offspring, individuals who hate their own culture because they think it's inferior, but they have to cloak that self-hatred in Afrocentric jargon, so they would rather tweak Eurocentric jargon, make it sound Afrocentric, try to retroactively date it to ancient cultures, including ancient Kemet, and then represent it to us as Kemetic doctrine. Monotheism is not Kemetic doctrine. Atheism is not Kemetic doctrine. Unconditional love is not a doctrine from ancient Kemet. Dissexuality, homosexuality, and so forth, and any form of sexual deviance, including interracial coupling, which is sexual deviance, is not the culture of ancient Kemet or any Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit culture. The culture is a reflection of divine order, and order is comprised of divine law or love and divine hate. We hate or reject those things, objects, deeds, and entities that create disorder, and we incorporate through law or love, law, the same word, those things, objects, deeds, and entities that will align us with divine order. The whites and their offspring, white Asians, white Europeans, white Latinos, white Hispanics, white pseudo-Native Americans, white Arabs, white Hindus, and so forth, are all spirits of disorder who incarnate as spirits of disorder. And there is no exception to that reality. And they will be that until they become extinct, until we make them extinct. That's the culture of ancient Kemet, and the culture of all Afuraitkaitnit across the board. Anybody who tries to promote that nonsense, white culture in the form of quote-unquote Kemeticism, either they're deliberately lying or they're just brainwashed and trying to cloak their insecurities in Afrocentric jargon while promoting Eurocentric nonsense. All right, so we want to just make sure, and we address these various topics in detail in the book, in our various books. Let me put the link up here. Wanted to touch on them in the various books, as well as the broadcast. The broadcast, very often we're examining the books in detail. At different aspects of the publications in detail. So we have the 15 books. They only range, the ebook versions, again, are free, so you can download them immediately. Softcover versions range between $8 and $11. So if you'd like to support our work, you can make a purchase of one or more of those publications. And then also when you look on the NHOMA page, you'll see the link to our AKONGUASUA Dine page. We have a fundraising campaign. We're at 2% right now, raising funds to establish a permanent physical location for our institution from which all our publications and teachings and classes and workshops, including substance abuse, abstinence, and domestic violence and so forth, overcoming those negative effects. We have those free workshops for the community. We're going to have all of that, including the publishing, entrepreneurship, as well as employment opportunities and so forth, in a physical center in this region, which will be the first of many that will open across the country as we expand out. but the first one will be here, and we'll be live streaming the class so people who can't be here can still participate in the various classes during the week. We're raising funds to establish that center, so when you look on the publications page, you'll also see the link to the AKONGUASUA Dime page. We have a GoFundMe campaign. We're at 2% right now. But then any donation you make, we will send you one or more of our books. So it's not just a donation. It's actually like a purchase, because you'll get the books in the mail, but at the same time, you know that when you purchase these books and you study them and you are enriched by the information, at the same time, that purchase has also helped to assist in the establishment of the first of our physical locations for our institution. So, and Yedase, we thank you to the individuals who so far already have made purchases. Some people have just given donations. Many people have made purchases of our books, and so this is why we're at 2%. We're trying to acquire this property as soon as possible so we can open up as soon as possible, hopefully within the month of January, as a matter of fact, to be able to secure the property itself. So we appreciate Yedase, everybody tuning in. If you have any questions that we missed, because it's like 11:22 now, if you have any questions, send us an email. If we missed your question online, I saw one of the on the phone line, it was something going on with the phone line where the person couldn't hear. So if you have a question, send us an email via the website, and we'll connect. You can send it to us through the OBRADWIRA.com website, ODWIRAF as in free o.com, ODWIRAF as in free o.com. That's OBRADWIRA.com, and go to the contact us section, and you can email us that way. You can also connect with us on Facebook. We are Afuraitkaitnit on Facebook, and then we have our own social network, private network that we pay for. Many Afrocentric groups, profiles are being deleted by Facebook. They're forcing people to change their names. A number of different things. They're shutting down Afrocentric groups, saying their content is too racial. Of course, the so-called white supremacist groups can be all over Facebook, but, somebody talking about African culture, spirituality, against homosexuality, against fake religions, and they're shutting these groups down. So, of course, you can use Facebook to connect with Afurakani people who are out there, but we also need our own networks, so there's not that kind of censorship. So, Afuraka-Afuraitkaitnit.ning.com. That's our social network. You can join it, create a profile. We post discussions, videos, blogs. People in this country and around the world who are studying this kind of information. We have a number of people on the site, so you can connect with us there as well. And anytime we have anything coming up, we always post it on that site. And finally, we also have our YouTube page, Ojirafo. Subscribe to us on YouTube, and anytime a new video comes out, which another one should be coming out soon, you'll automatically be updated. You can also follow us on our Blog Talk channel, and we can send a mass email out to alert you of the broadcast coming up if you follow us on the Blog Talk channel. And, of course, on Twitter, we're Ojirafo. On Instagram, we are Afuraka. So, Yedase, we thank everybody for tuning in, and, we will connect with you next week on Joada for NANANOMSOM, Ancient Authentic Ancestral Religion. The following day, Tuesday, Benada for Ojira, Purification, and then the following day, EGUA, Marketplace Day. So three times a week, 9 p.m. Eastern, we have our broadcast. And then all of the archives, there are about 75 shows that are archived right now, and you can go through all that information as well. So, Yedase, we thank you for tuning in, and Yebeshia Bio, we will meet again.